Hey, this is Tony.
This is Paul coming at you from the Friends for Life podcast.
And we're go.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Friends for Life podcast here on YouTube. Before we dive into the podcast, if you can help us out, go down below, hit that subscribe button. Today, our special guest is Katherine Hunt Thomas of the Disabilities Center, and we talk about her career as a lawyer advocating for those with disabilities. We talk about the mayor's office on disability, which is something that we're really excited to finally get some clarity on, as well as she clarifies a lot of cool legal stuff that we didn't really know too much about until now, including like the ADA and stuff like that. So you're not going to want to miss this one. Let's dive right into it. All right, everybody. Welcome back to the Friends for Life podcast. Katie, we have Katie Hunt Thomas today from the Disabilities Center. Katie, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing great. I love stormy mornings. How are you doing?
Doing awesome. We are up here. This is early for us, noon to do a podcast. We're usually like 5 p.m. kind of guys.
Yeah,
but
that's the best time. But people like Katie are very busy and important, so we have to get. I mean, just look at the beautiful background. If you guys can't see her, if you're just listening, you have to see. She has a wonderful office view.
Yeah. So before we get into a bunch of topics that we kind of wanted to touch on today, why don't you let us know a little bit about yourself and your history with becoming a lawyer and how you've kind of fell into the disabilities field, which eventually led you to the Disabilities Center.
Yeah, so that's an interesting story. I normally tell people that for me, ending up at the Disabilities Center has been sort of a journey of self-discovery. So I have a sister who is 4 years younger than me who has Down syndrome. Her name is Maggie. Right now she's 34, so she's clearly an adult. And we grew up together. I mean, she is my sister and my peer and my friend. I ended up going into law because I wanted to go into public interest. I wanted to be someone who could, help change the world to make things better. Sounds a little optimistic, but that is something that we're actually able to work on in public interest law. And so my goal was always to go into a public interest field. But I had no idea I was actually interested in disability law, despite having a sister with a significant disability, until I ended up at the Disabilities Center. I went to the University of Toledo College of Law, where I was able to work with a disability law professor and take her disability law class, and did very well in that. I also wrote an independent study with her on an issue in disability law. But after law school, I actually started out at Advocates for Basic Legal Equality. I got a housing and transportation fellowship there. And I thought that was what I would always want to do. But when my fellowship ended, I was looking around and I realized that disability was something I was interested in. I actually reached out to the Disabilities Center to see if they would want me to do any work for them. And I ended up getting my position there as the disability rights attorney. And then eventually I was promoted to director of advocacy. And it really wasn't until I made that decision that I realized that I've been inspired by having a sister who has significant disability, seeing the challenges that she's faced, especially in ensuring that the world is inclusive, and welcoming for her. So a lot of her challenges involved getting a employment or a job that was inclusive and in the community, and having access to transportation that would allow her to be independent. And I get to work on all of those different issues here at the Disabilities Center. So
that's awesome.
Once I got this job, I realized it was what I had been aiming for and wanted to do all along, but I didn't really know it until I was actually here. So
that's always cool when your like your personal life and your career kind of merges together.
Yeah.
I've been blessed enough to, have the same kind of scenario, just slightly different. So with you and your sister growing up, did you attend like Special Olympics or anything like that?
Oh yes. So Special Olympics has been a big part of my life and her life for almost her entire life. She's actually a national Special Olympics champion.
Whoa,
She was able to
nice.
go to the National Special Olympics in track, I think 3 years ago now, and she won a couple gold medals. So her whole life is often structured around what sport she's competing in at the moment.
I hear
Track
that.
is obviously one. She's a very good swimmer. Golf is another one that she does.
We just had a gentleman up here not too long ago, and I'm trying to get in the golfing world. His name is Michael Malone, and I suck at, like, I'm okay at putt-putt, I guess. And I love going to the driving range. I think the driving range is pretty cool. But when it comes to like planning out where things are supposed to go when you hit the ball, which club to use, and I'm like, whoa, that's
Completely lost.
too much for me. So maybe she can give me a pointer or two.
Can you kind of give us a brief overview of what the Ability Center does for people who don't know, maybe in the Toledo disability world, kind of where you guys come into play?
Yeah, the Ability Center is what's called a Center for Independent Living. So sometimes people think that means housing. We don't provide housing. Our goal is to provide services and then also advocacy to help people with disabilities live independently in the community. So we have 7 different programs. We're a mid-sized organization that does a lot of different things. The ones that most people are familiar with are our Service Dogs program. The Assistance Dogs for Achieving Independence program provides dogs for people who are mobility impaired. And then we also have a number of other programs. We have our home accessibility program that will build ramps and lifts for people with disabilities. We have an equipment loan program that allows people to borrow durable medical equipment. We have a youth program that helps people, youth with disabilities, transition, into employment. We have information and referral that will refer people to resources in the community. And then we have advocacy, and that is the program that I am part of. I am the director of our advocacy program. We try to change systems to help people live independently in the community. We, just an interesting fact, are one of 12 centers for independent living in Ohio. And we are part of a national network of centers for independent living across the country. So the first Center for Independent Living was established in Berkeley, California in the 60s and 70s, and then became a national network of centers. We have a national organization called the National Council on Independent Living, NICL, that does advocacy at a national level and then also coordinates with their local counterparts. So we do we're quite a big organization, and we do quite a few different things. But it's all centered around assisting people with disabilities to live independently in the community, and all of our different programs tend to shift to respond to that, whatever that need is.
Yeah, and now, are you guys, for our listeners, are your services paid through waiver services like Medicaid and Medicare?
So that is going to be program specific.
Okay.
The majority of our programs are free, and we are cross disability organizations.
Hold on.
So
let's go back.
In order to be eligible,
Is it free or is it free?
Well, free.
Free? Okay, good. Just
yes,
making sure.
There are no payment for our services, but some of our programs, like the RAMP program, are part of grants. So
Gotcha.
Eligibility would depend on whether someone qualifies under a grant, or occasionally there might be some fees associated, but our programs are free.
Yeah.
If there's a fee, it has to do with some sort of structure involving a grant.
Gotcha. So. Now, and do you guys have like your own grant writers in hand, or do you kind of reach out to people in different avenues depending on the scenario?
We do have a grant writer
Okay.
that works for the Ability Center.
So Tony and I just watched a documentary called Crip Camp on Netflix, and it's so funny because we're looking up your bio on the Ability Center website, and you basically kind of have experience with all of the stuff they talked about, and then you just talked about Berkeley in the 70s. So I don't know if you've seen the movie or not, but it's a super great movie. Can you maybe do just like a few seconds or a minute here on kind of like the ADA and then the 504 or Section 504 and kind of how impactful those were for people with disabilities over the last like 40, 50 years?
Yeah, sure. And, part of my job is to try and ensure that people are educated on and also complying with those acts. Yeah. So people with disabilities, it's been a long struggle to be integrated within the community. So ultimately, what the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504 are mainstreaming statutes. There's a long history in the U.S. of people with disabilities sort of being shut away and put in institutions where they had no access to regular society. And so people weren't seen, and also they weren't able to interact in general society. There were institutions where people lived. There were disability-only schools. A lot of people in the 50s and 60s were just sent away to an institution maybe after they were born. And when the 50s and 60s hit, the 60s and 70s hit, and there was a civil rights movement, people with disabilities were inspired by that movement as well. They decided to organize and to fight for their own rights. So that the main places that they wanted to do that were in the areas of education. So a lot of people with disabilities back then were considered or declared uneducable and weren't allowed into mainstream schools or weren't allowed to be educated at all. And then also just in community integration. So there were a lot of people with disabilities weren't allowed to participate in community activities and weren't able to exercise independence by being in the community. There was also a lot of discrimination in employment. A lot of people with disabilities had trouble getting jobs simply because they had a disability. So there was a lot of grassroots organizing. The independent living movement, which is what the Centers for Independent Living came out of, was part of that. So there was someone in Berkeley who not only started the Berkeley Center for Independent Living as the first center, but sort of came up with the independent living philosophy that it was barriers in society and not something intrinsic in people with disabilities that were causing this lack of independence and community integration. So with all that, one of the things that they decided to do is to organize for laws to be passed. Section 504, which applies to organizations that receive federal funding or contract with the federal government, was the very first law they were able to get passed. And it was the very first law that made architectural barriers. So people with disabilities who have mobility impairments are sometimes blocked or kept out of organizations and facilities just because they're not accessible to them. So Section 504 in the Architectural Barriers Act was the very first act that required, federal facilities to get rid of architectural barriers. But it also made discrimination on the basis of disability illegal in federally funded activities. So, just to
sorry
keep it
to cut
simple.
you off real quick, Katie, because I'm thinking about the movie as you just mentioned, and like once it got to the point where the 504 was actually passed and everything, you see this gentleman kind of going down the street, New York City street, or even I think it could have been even San Francisco, but anyway, it was a public street and he had a ramp to go up. And like, it's been so obvious to us, like those things have been there for quite a while, but to see the fight to get it, I just always want to point out, like, it was not a simple struggle,
No.
It was a lot of, like you said, grassroots, and just creating, again, people watch the movie. Like, oh my goodness.
Yeah, it was not a simple struggle. People who aren't in the disability community don't always understand why that's so important.
Mhm.
But imagine, working in an office where you can't use the bathroom.
Yeah.
Like how are you going to work? One of the stories that I heard pre-ADA was a person who was able to get a job in a government building, but they couldn't use the bathroom. So
Wow.
because it wasn't accessible. So they had to go home at lunch every day to use the bathroom and
Wow.
then come back. Or if there's no accessible entrance, someone with a mobility impairment literally can't get in the door. So
Mhm.
then how are they supposed to work? Or how are they supposed to, participate in their community? So those things are very important, as is, the ADA and Section 504 are very broad. So they apply to other things as well. Um, After the ADA and 504 were passed, an organization couldn't say someone couldn't participate just because they have a disability, which actually happened, before they were
Yeah.
passed. The organizations are required to provide alternate formats for documents. So, say someone's blind and they rely on Braille, organizations would be required to provide them, Braille copies.
Mhm.
Or if someone's deaf, they're required to provide an ASL interpreter. So, they're very broad laws that were passed to ensure that people with disabilities could participate in their community.
And what is the
So
cell
they're very
phone
important
thing?
to
The
independence. Yeah, go
the
ahead.
I'm sorry, the cell phone thing. What was that? Is it TTY or something? So
Yes.
yes,
Uh-huh.
like I remember being a teenager and seeing that service and trying it out. I didn't know what it was about. So, I called it and I'm sitting there, I'm speaking to someone and they're texting it what I'm speaking to someone else.
Yeah.
And then vice versa. I did it the other way where I could type it in and they were speaking it. And even the guy who was doing it at the time said, "I don't think the person on the other end understands what we're here for." And I wasted a lot of taxpayers' dollars thinking it was something revolutionary for me, but knowing that others could use it, it was an eye opener. Like, wow,
Yeah.
I see where we're going, and this is good.
And that was established by the ADA. The ADA required that TTY, that telecommunication companies
Hmm.
made TTY an option.
Look at that.
So again, like imagine if you were deaf or had a hearing impairment and couldn't call someone on the phone.
Hmm.
Um, so they were revolutionary laws, but they had to be passed very gradually. Like we were talking about, Section 504 was only a first step because it only applied to federally funded activities. And then in between Section 504 and ADA, there was a long period of time where people with disabilities were organizing, doing protests, gathering stories, petitioning, Congress, and then President Bush actually signed the ADA, and the only way he got the political power to actually sign the document is that there was a protest going on right in the Capitol steps right before he signed it, where a group of people with disabilities who had mobility impairments showed how inaccessible the Capitol was by climbing out of their wheelchairs and
Parents,
climbing
yeah.
up the steps to get into the Capitol. It's called the Capitol Crawl. So yeah, it was very hard won, and then they ended up being very broad and comprehensive statutes, some of which people don't know, what kinds of rights and protections were actually established and how they were
Hmm.
designed to slowly change our world to make it more accessible.
Yeah.
And there's clearly a lot of change that still needs to be made, but that change has been happening now, over the past 31 years.
Well, on that note, there was obviously within the last month the huge announcement that Toledo is going to have a mayor's office on disabilities, and you were part of the conversation. So we're
Yes, yes,
very
yes.
glad you could join us to kind of provide a little clarity on the podcast here. First off, what's the Ability Center role within this mayor's office on disability, and kind of, what is the vision going to be down the road, maybe for how this is going to operate?
And give me the lowdown on who the other people are, because I need to know this.
It's very exciting.
Yeah.
One of our campaigns, the Ability Center turned 100 last year.
Wow, nice.
And we were going to have a
great
huge
granddad.
celebration. And then COVID hit. Like, I feel like that's the story for everything.
Yeah, right.
But our campaign for our 100 years was that Toledo needs to be the most disability-friendly community in the country. And we've always worked with the city of Toledo, to try and, as part of our systems change, to try and make Toledo as accessible as possible to people with disabilities, but with this broader goal of making Toledo the most disability-friendly community in the country, we needed to do something bigger. So, there are also always issues out there, and there are actually 13 different organizations that agreed to sign on to a letter asking the city of Toledo to establish this mayor's office on disability. So the ADA actually requires the city to have what's called an ADA coordinator. So that's, a compliance officer usually. So someone who has to ensure that the city's complying with the Americans with Disabilities Act. But we wanted something bigger. And so 13 organizations agreed to sign on to a letter asking the city to establish the mayor's office on disability. And we are only one of the very few cities in the entire country that has a whole mayor's office on disability.
Mm-hmm.
And our goal is to try and go above and beyond those ADA requirements, and really have a goal for the city of Toledo to make the city as inclusive as possible. So rather than just having a compliance officer, we have an office that can act as a liaison to the public, to people with disabilities, to hear what the issues are and try to address them. And then also that can create programming. So rather than just look at whether the city's complying, can research and design best practice programming to ensure people with disabilities are included in the city. The Ability Center is on the outside of this. Since the position was posted, I've actually gotten a couple of people contacting me asking how they can apply. We're not interviewing, anybody for the director position. We are on the outside, but we are in the process of, along with the group of 13 organizations, working with the city to design the office as best we can. They've been really open to talking to us and getting our input on what that should look like. So, I'm very excited. I think that just having more resources dedicated to that area will really help the city, make this a best practice, make it a leader in the country for what we can do in terms of community inclusion.
Yeah, it was really interesting to us because, you guys have obviously, with all the other organizations, been working on this really hard for a long time. But we just kind of woke up one day to all these text messages like, hey, did you see the announcement? We're like, what? Yeah. Oh, no. Yes. Sure. So we kind of dove into it. And it's really a great thing because, like we've mentioned in the past on other episodes we've talked, for Toledo, this is huge because a lot of the other cities that have done this are like huge cities. Like we're talking like New York, Los Angeles. Like Toledo doesn't even remotely compare in size to those cities. So that's very, very awesome. And kind of maybe before we wrap things up here, I guess, you're advocating all the time. That's your job. Are there any things that you'd really think that you'd like to see kind of change? Like I always like to say, if you could like snap your fingers and things were just better in one aspect of the disabilities world, do you have any kind of stuff like that that you would change immediately if you could?
Oh yeah. So we're talking City of Toledo specific, right?
It doesn't matter anywhere.
Well, when we're talking about the mayor's office on disability, there were 3 issues we mentioned in the press conference. And so in City of Toledo, I would say the 3 biggest issues that we hear that are local issues are transportation. So a lot of people with disabilities cannot drive because of their disability, and they're completely reliant on public transit to get anywhere. So, I mean, we're talking getting to a job. We're talking going grocery shopping. We're talking about medical care. There are areas of Lucas County public transit does not go. So that means that many people with disabilities just can't go there. I mean, one example we've heard is St. Charles in Oregon. Sometimes people are brought to the hospital via ambulance and then can't get home because there's no public transit to bring them home.
We've had that scenario.
So especially if you are trying to work and have a very set schedule, trying to get there without public transit is very challenging. I would say in city of Toledo, that is likely the biggest issue that we hear for people with disabilities. Another one is housing. So especially for people with mobility impairments, housing is not designed in an accessible manner. And especially in a city like Toledo, where a lot of the housing is older, pre even really knowledge about accessibility, a lot of the housing stock is not accessible. So again, people don't always completely understand that when they're not in the community. But if someone uses a wheelchair and has no accessible entrance into their home, they literally cannot leave their home, or they can't get into their home. So again, or if they don't have an accessible bathroom, it's very difficult, to use the bathroom. So those things are really important to being independent, and being able to, live within the community. And then the final thing that, we brought up is employment. So employment, despite the ADA, is still one of the major challenges that face people with disabilities. There's still a lack of employers that, there's still some sort of unjustified assumptions about what people with disabilities can do and cannot do. Those are all issues that I would hope that this Mayor's Office on Disability would help try to rectify in our region. And I have faith that that they will, and that there will be some programs that will help change the face of that here. So if someone wants to live independently, they have to have a job, they have to be able to get there, and they have to have a place to live. Those are three issues that I think it would be really wonderful to have some action on by the Mayor's Office on Disability.
Yeah. Awesome. That answered the question greatly. So before we go, we like to do one little thing. Tony, why don't you introduce her to rapid fire questioning? Don't worry, it's not that terrible.
I mean, to some, we've had some pretty sad occasions, but it's going to be fun. You're going to like it. If you don't, you can talk about us later. All right. First rapid fire question is favorite movie during quarantine?
Back to the Future.
Back to the Future? The original?
The original.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I think Back to the Future a lot like the Godfather films. 1 and 2 are good. 3 is like that stepchild that you should never speak of.
Yes, definitely number one.
Okay. Guilty pleasure at midnight. G-rated.
At midnight? Sleep. I have a 3-year-old.
Like.
So just being asleep in my bed at midnight is very nice.
Nice. Lastly, favorite TV series of 2020?
Of 2020.
Or Netflix.
Yeah, or Netflix,
Yeah. I'm trying to think what I watched this year. I don't know why this...
This one always stumps people.
Yep,
it really does.
It's because of the 2020 thing. I think the last year is just a big blur.
Yes.
What is that? Was Game of Thrones, was that 2020 or was that?
I think that's been like over the last like 10 years,
Yeah.
but that's a good answer. I like it.
Yeah, I think you were our second Game of Thrones.
I love Game of Thrones.
Yeah,
Yeah.
look, I remember seeing something where everybody pointed out the bloopers in the final season, like they were mad that they shot it so fast or something.
Yeah, we won't. That's a whole nother podcast. So we can go off the rails on Game of Thrones for hours.
Yeah, I feel like that would take you past your hour if we got into that discussion.
So before we head out, thank you for joining us. And why don't you let people know where they can learn more about the Ability Center, whether it be a website or social media or all of the above?
Yeah, all of the above. You can go to our website, abilitycenter.org. And then we also have a Facebook page, a Twitter feed, like us, follow us. And you can follow everything we're doing. We have a lot going on. Like I said, we have 7 different programs that are in some ways very specialized. So lots of different activities and things going on. Please follow us, like us. And we always look forward to engaging with new folks as well.
Yeah, that's that's awesome, and I can see that just in 2019, you guys served over 1,100 people. So that is very awesome. Hopefully, the numbers continue to stack up. The more people we can help, the better we will be. So thank you again for coming on, Katie. We got to have you again some other time with more legal stuff because I'm kind of, I don't know much.
Well, it was nice to be here. I appreciate you guys inviting us on the podcast, and I do hope we're able to do it again.
Hey, thank you so much.
Thank you. Have it easy.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for watching this episode of the Friends for Life podcast here on YouTube. If you can't help us out, go down below, hit that subscribe button. If you want to be extra helpful today, which I know you're feeling extra helpful all the time, so no question there, head over to iTunes or Stitcher and leave the podcast a rating or review. That really just helps boost our rank in the podcasting world, which in turn helps us get more advocacy for those with disabilities. I want to thank Katherine Hunt Thomas for coming on today and sharing all of her awesome knowledge from a career in the disabilities field and in being a lawyer. She has a lot more clarity on stuff that we don't really know about, so we want to thank her for that. You guys should definitely head over to the Ability Center website and check out more about what they do. And thank you for watching. We will see you next week.